Our next speaker is going to cover a slightly different topic, but he's been up here a little earlier on, and that's Djarra Delaney. Djarra's a Quantamuka man and a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, but he's not going to talk as much about his PhD studies at present, but some of the work that he started working on at the Bureau of Meteorology, where he was an Indigenous employee around traditional weather knowledge and how that knowledge can be used in different parts of Australia and is actually different in different parts of Australia, recognising the differences. Djarra, take it away.
Hello again. Good afternoon, everyone. Is that okay? All right, great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about traditional weather knowledge. It is an interesting area of thinking, and I'll look at it a little bit from, say, like an institutional perspective and tell a bit of the story of how I got involved in it. And then I will give you some examples just off the top of my head from what I remember, but because of the time constraints, I'll just encourage you to go and check them out if you have time, because there's lots to look at and way too much for 15 minutes. But yeah, so let's click through. Down. Okay, so I come from Quantamuka country. That is the Redland Bay area of southeast Queensland. So that includes Minjerribah, which is North Stradbroke Island. That's the one at the bottom, like the one that you can see there. Mangolpin, Morton Island, which is the tail, you can see the tail end of it, north. And the surrounding sea country, and also the mainland of Redland Shire. So that includes the Southern Bay Islands and basically all that area. So we have native title determinations over Minjerribah and Mangolpin, the sea country as well. And we're now looking at a process for Redland Shire, but being that it's a city, it's very complicated in a very contested space. So likewise, I want to echo some of that conversation from Oliver, which was our peoples also have stories of the bay turning into a bay, really, from the end of the last ice age. Before that, it was wetlands, and the sea levels were 100 meters lower. So if you can imagine that, then obviously that whole area there looked very different in the old days. And it goes to questions around archaeological evidence, and really highlights how I guess I feel unfair, or how difficult the native title system is, because it asks you to prove continuous connections to country, and through colonization, but also through movement. Those connections, you know, we're asked to kind of prove our indigeneity. So that's just, you know, a bit off book, but why not? So what is traditional weather knowledge? So it's more or less a subcategory of traditional ecological knowledge, which you'll see pop up a lot in kind of Western academic institutions. So from my perspective, it's kind of a Western label for ways of knowing and being on country, experiences of kind of cyclical environmental change that can be observed and predicted from year to year. And I like to kind of this word of like disciplinization, which is a way that I guess a Western scientific framework or a Western mindset is able to understand or categorized Indigenous knowledges in some ways. So traditional weather knowledge is a kind of sub-discipline of a disciplinization of what I would kind of consider to be culture and observations of place. So yeah, worth thinking about. I like that word. I think it is critical of kind of Western knowledge institutions or hegemony. And yeah, but essentially traditional weather knowledge is observations that are passed down through thousands of generations and reflect a kind of deep learning of the environment. And we heard a lot about that just then. So that's really actually a great segue. So this is a quote I really like, and it's kind of goes back to that video that we just saw before from Tony Ligon, the TEDx talk. And this is from Linda Black Elk. She is a Native American scholar. But I really like this because it kind of throws into question this kind of supremacy of Western knowledge, being that, like, as she says, native science has its foundations in the very same scientific method that we, as researchers trained in the Western world, all hold so near and dear. So for her, it was long-term observational data is nothing new to Indigenous peoples. We have been observing the world around us for millennia, gaining an understanding of its systems and processes. So I like that because it kind of goes like, well, you know, you say that you had the kind of Enlightenment period and that's where the scientific method came from, but it's like, it's nothing new to our people, and that system of observation and experimentation with things and understanding how the world works is common and not particularly, you know, not like that only, that system doesn't hold its head high above anything else. So this is the front cover of the Indigenous Weather Knowledge website. I really recommend people go to it. I'm not going to show any of the wheels because I don't work at the Bureau anymore, and the rights that the communities gave the Bureau were to like do educational stuff and things like that, which I could do, but I want to make sure that it's within, for me, cultural protocols where that's their IP. So if there's someone from Bamba and Ngurubul who wants to talk about their calendar, they can do that. But this is the website. The artwork was from late artist Laurie Nilsson, who was a kind of friend of mine. So that is a really, I really recommend going to this website and having a click around because it goes to show all the different variations in seasonal information from quite complicated systems in the south. If anyone's from Melbourne, you know, they say 6 seasons in a day or whatever. And so that's really true. You know, like Garrowwood calendar is quite complicated. It's got 6 different calendars, and the one that floats around Melbourne that people you might see occasionally is got 7, I think, or 8 sometimes. And so as you go around kind of country, there's a real big variation in the observed seasonal patterns from the south of Australia all through the east coast, west coast, and then into the kind of the monsoon areas in the north where it's really wet, dry, build up. And so and the variations are also really interesting where you might have certainly, you know, we've heard a bit about like indicators. So when plant and animal availabilities are informing the change into a new season or new weather patterns or phenomena, lightning time, build up, you know, humidity. I'll talk about it in a bit. That is the IWK. So if you go to the Bureau websites at the bottom, but I just would go Indigenous Weather Knowledge on Google and it'll be the first link at the top. So, and this is Indigenous Seasonal Calendars at CSIRO. Also, I've embedded the link on the PowerPoint. So if we want to send around the slides or whatever to delegates or to attendees, that's fine too. And now these have a bunch of, they're called the tracker maps, and go here and they've got a whole other section of seasonal calendars. So that is at CSIRO. And so the Bureau and CSIRO are both doing seasonal calendar work, and it's an interesting area. So I'll talk a bit about how I came to it. So I grew up in Brisbane, did my undergrad more in communications style stuff, and got a job at the Bureau through Indigenous Graduate Pathways program with the Australian government. And yeah, joined up in 2014 and started off just doing typical grad work, but found in there an old website that looked from about 2001, maybe. And it was very old school, very like, it was like yellow and it had like all this old stuff. And so, and I thought, wow, this stuff is so, like, if this is the Weather Bureau, this needs to be represented as part of the Weather Bureau service properly. And so a few years later, well, after my grad program, I ended up getting the opportunity to work as a kind of manager to bring that website up to a kind of a modern look technically, and then also had the opportunity to travel to a few places to host the seasonal information. And I say host very deliberately because in that process, we also rewrote some of the rules that underpin the website, which is that copyright and IP is held in community. It's essentially just a library space, like an online library for communities to host their knowledge and get it out into a wider audience, and also just have it there kind of in perpetuity to access if they need to, and pull if they want to, and do with what they want. So that was a general idea, and it was kind of, I really liked the outcome. I thought it looked really great, and was really grateful for Laurie Nilsson for that blue kind of artwork there. No, here we go. Yeah, so I talked a little bit about it, but the indicators, and we've heard actually a lot about it today, and I wanted to stop here to really acknowledge that expertise in this area is not held at the Bureau or at CSIRO or anywhere really. It's held in elders in community. So, and it is represented in stories, in songlines, in dreaming stories, in art that's reproduced or that's produced to describe, availabilities of water or anything. So with that video that we saw earlier today, and it had Arnie Pat's artwork on the Opera House, that is seasonal weather information, knowledge, just not presented in a way that's digestible for, say, a Western scientific organization where they want the wheel so that it works really well for what they're doing. So in a sense, the wheel is a translation of knowledge, and knowledge that elders have allowed to be shared into a wider audience. So there's a million other things held in the great wisdom of our community elders that is extremely important for younger Indigenous peoples to listen to and just kind of remember and learn as we go through our lives, and make sure that we protect our old people and put energy into, listening to them and hearing their guidance. So that's just, I thought that was really, I felt very lucky to see that video earlier today and be like, oh, that's exactly. But oftentimes it'll be, if you look at the seasonal information on the website, go and do that this afternoon. It's really great. Monsoon, trade winds, the way in which these indicators arrive informs activity, and it informs what communities are doing, where they're moving to, and this kind of, I like arrival and abundance. I made that up, but it's like when plants are flowering or when there's heaps of animals, a particular variety of animals there, that might mark a seasonal change into a new phase. But climate change is interceding to disrupt those typical patterns. And I think that's really important to recognize. So if we think about how communities might respond to climate change, which I'll talk a bit more on Wednesday, there's information there for communities built within their own cultural knowledge, and it's a good base from which to then, talk to Western science. And I always try and make a point of saying there's this kind of narrative that it's about, Western science working with Indigenous knowledge, which is true, but I often think it's like kind of the wrong way around. Like I often think it's Indigenous people have a way of understanding information that can incorporate like heaps of different wedges and heaps of different segments of knowledge. And so it's actually, if you like flip it upside down, it's actually in community, and it's actually in like Indigenous people that relationship can happen, because unfortunately, we're all under the pressures of those systems, that mindset, capitalism, neoliberalism, imperialism, colonialism, these pressures that we all face, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, white Australian, settler, people who come to Australia from other countries, like that, these pressures are all there in all of us, trying to inform the way that we think. And it's about rejecting some of those more insidious notions and say, hey, let's take a step back and think about where we are. We're on Aboriginal land. Who are the people that are going to help take some of that climate science info, their own science, and kind of, that's where it can be done really effectively. And I've seen it done a million times where, if you go into a place that's feeling impacts from climate change, they're all over it. They've got their cultural knowledge, they've got their stuff that they've got weather knowledge, they've got seasonal information, they understand how things are changing, and they're also incorporating heaps of climate science, complicated sciences into their planning. So it's really important, I think. I also want to give a shout out to astronomy as well. So those astronomical indicators are really great, and they often pop up. And if we think about in the Torres Strait with the Tagai, the star systems and navigation, or dark emu, like all these things that occur, it's like really, really intense and very exciting scientific information that I think that's getting the space it deserves now. But yeah, this is a nice quote as well. I probably won't read through it, but it's about that reciprocal, because we've been talking about it today, but it's like that reciprocal environmental relationship, and having that as the basis from which to kind of approach life, I think is really important. But Carl White's a great academic, and he talks a lot about, all these problems with climate and systems. So really recommend. So I think traditional weather knowledge, I was thinking about this last night when I did this slide up, it's culture, right? It's just how you exist in your place. Like, it is just culture. It's fundamental, it's intrinsic. Traditional ecological knowledge is the same. It's disrupted, and there's a lot of pressures from the colonial systems and the histories of violence and oppression. And so, for communities to refine that love of and that connection is, I think, step one in building, good climate management or other things like that. So yeah, land and sea management, that's where traditional seasonal weather knowledge can come in. Climate management, looking at how things have changed. Fire management. This is a photo of Kayak. That's the Quandamooka Yulubari by Aboriginal Corporation. That's our prescribed body. That's them just doing some cultural burning. I was talking to a cousin who actually, I'll talk about it on Wednesday, but it was a really cool story about protecting some of the cultural value sites by kind of clearing some of that overgrown bush from that had grown up through basically Indigenous people not being able there to like manage the country. And so it just really grew up, and they were really worried about some cultural sites. So did some burning around there. That was very successful. Tradition and ceremony. So when to go, when to do, so tradition might inform seasonal change, but also might be informed by it. And activities. So I think it's important to know that it's still in use, like trevally season, when to go fishing, when to go brim fishing, when to go grab this or that, or when, little bush cherries are available, my grandma, or when to go and get little bush passion fruit out and that my grandma collects and stuff. So it's like this knowledge is not, and everyone has it really, if you think about, fish people like fish. I think I always like to think of fishermen or fisher people because, they like, it's always this season or that season, like this is when this is running or not. And it's kind of a really good example of how that's used. And also in Indigenous agriculture, of course, which is, when to collect and harvest. So I also want to talk about intellectual property, I think, a little bit, because it's important. If we're talking about traditional weather knowledge or tech generally, traditional ecological knowledge, it's property, like it is copyright. That's why I didn't include any of the calendars because I wanted to reaffirm this point, which is that that's art, like we saw before, songs, dance, stories, knowledge, and also practices and sciences. And they got a right to determine the use of that knowledge, and always ask before you use something if you're not sure, if you're a researcher or otherwise, seek guidance from those elders in community. Yeah, I thought I'd just show this as a bit of a thing. It's in the kayak book, which I really liked. But yeah, it's just a bit of a story. I won't go through it, but it's a nice artwork from Uncle Josh Walker at Quandamuka. You know, he's a cultural man, and yeah, it's got a bit of that sand, you know, the southeast wind spirit. You know, it's got that seasonal knowledge into that in that artwork. Which we had a good example earlier today. So this was going to be my example for art, but I think Arnie Pass was really good as well. And that video was great. And then, yeah, also in just stories. So I just wanted to highlight, this is a book by Udru Nunakul, who is a famous poet from Quandamuka country. And I read this stuff when I was a kid. And in that, those stories, you know, even though they're aimed at kind of, you know, that's aimed at educating our kids, all that seasonal information that's in there, like when those things are going, what the seasons are going to do. And I just really wanted to highlight that it's not just in the calendars that are held in institutions, even though they're awesome and check them out. It's also just in the kind of culture. And I think that's a really important point where it's like, just, you know, go out there and have yarns with people and they'll tell you heaps of stuff about country and seasons and climate change, and it's all there. So that's a cool book if you're ever interested in some of the Dreamtime stuff on Stradbroke. And that's my contacts too. So reach out. That's my student email, but also my LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Djarra. And look, that was a really helpful session on the culture, the value of cultural knowledge, with the example essentially of the weather knowledge that's helped to understand how culture involves, you know, or not just traditional knowledge in the Indigenous communities, but there's enormous traditional knowledge in whatever, all the regions around the world.